Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we have a selection of horrors from the police force. They truly bear witness to some terrifying stuff, which you're about to find out. So get comfortable, and let the darkness take control. My partner and I got a tip from a narcotics source to check out an abandoned bowling alley for some activity. It was the middle of the day, so we didn't expect anything to be going on right then. We called in and pulled up from the back entrance to have a look around. Lo and behold, there were heavy chains on all the doors, except for one side door, where the chain had been cut with an angle grinder or something similar. The bowling alley faced a fairly busy highway, so our first thought was that local drug dealers were using it as a convenient stash/pack spot, or that there were squatters inside. We pulled our weapons and flashlight, called for another car, and went in. We came in from the side, looking across the lanes, about even with the scoring terminals. A quick look around, and it was obvious that people had been there. Empty beer cans, cigarette butts everywhere, certain boxes of sandwich bags sitting out on the little empty tables. The place smelled like 20 years worth of cigarette smoke, mildew, wet wood, old plastic, rusty metal, and musty seat cushions. It was a very familiar kind of smell after Katrina. I don't remember who saw her first, my partner or me. There was a woman at the far end of the lanes, away from the door and hidden from the front windows. She was in an orange dress, the skirt pulled up around her waist, and the top pulled down under her breasts. She was lying on the floor between two benches, as if she were passed out drunk. A young black lady. She was wearing very dirty sandals with gold-coloured straps and little fake jewels across the tops. Her skin was dark, shiny, and blotchy, and contrasted sharply with the soft, bright orange material. Her head was completely removed, crudely and raggedly, as though it was sawn off. We stared at her for a few seconds, taking it all in, the colours washed out somewhat by the harsh beams of our bright tack lights. All my partner could muster were the words, "Goddamn," and I barfed into my mouth before the smell even really registered. This scene turned out to have been a couple of days old, and the metallic, rotting smell was turned up to 11 by midday, by the heat trapped inside the building. There was a huge pool of blood around her torso and neck, almost black, and bleeding into the dark industrial carpet that was between the lanes and the snack bar. Her limbs were grotesquely swollen and flung outwards, the straps of her sandals digging into her feet. Backup pulled up right as we staggered through the backside door into the harsh sunlight. It was our supervisor, and the young officer he was FTOing. We explained the situation, and he called for more units and the coroner so they could secure and begin processing the scene. We put some Vicks on and went back in to look behind the snack bar and the counter, where her shoes were. The sergeant found the lady's head on the floor behind the snack bar. Her teeth were showing as if she was growling, and her eyes were swollen and puffed out. There were several squadrons of flies and gnats buzzing around the head, like she was wearing a wig, which had partially come off, and the whole thing was almost comical. Like a wax head, where the details weren't quite right. but my brain kept screaming at me that this was a person's head. It felt like all the emotions I could possibly feel were fighting together in my stomach. I've seen hundreds of corpses throughout my career, but this one is burned into the film of my memory. We continued to perform some mundane functions at the scene for a little while, but once the others started arriving, our lieutenant sent us back to the office to start writing up our notes. The investigation later revealed that the woman was a prostitute. She was involved with a drug dealer who used the bowling alley for business purposes and to entertain clients. I think the story came to be that she was offered as payment to another drug dealer from Central America, and this person murdered her while he was having sex with her, right there on the floor. He slit her throat with a knife and continued until she was fully decapitated, either during or right after the rape. I think I remember that the suspect was identified, but I know he was never caught. This was by far the worst scene that I ever saw firsthand. I'm not a cop, but an EMT. We had a call for pedestrian hit by a car on a rural road. We haul ass over there and find a 12-year-old female in the road, with her dad standing over her. She was riding her bike in her driveway with her whole family out in the lawn. She cycled down into the road and was immediately hit by an older man driving a large old Cadillac. The car was driving at 55 to 60, and because the bicycle this girl had hits the windshield, but her head hits the passenger side column. The girl doesn't die on impact, and is instead bleeding out through the large piece of her skull that has been caved in half. The girl can't talk, but she's blinking and making sounds. Her dad, who has been drinking for the better part of a day, sees the whole thing. He immediately runs out into the road and starts doing the only thing he's ever seen from TV: CPR. Thanks to his woefully drunk version of CPR, he not only crushes her ribs and lungs, but effectively helps her bleed out faster. To make things worse, I have a brand new paramedic with me, who has never seen anything like this. Almost as soon as we arrive, this girl has no pulse and blood is everywhere. A volunteer firefighter showed up on scene and is trying to pull the dad off the girl. Dad and the firefighter get into a full-on fight. We get there, assess her, and try to control the bleeding, but she's gone. Massive trauma. No pulse, no lung sounds, head caved in, laying in a pool of blood bigger than she is. Her whole body is broken. Another EMS unit shows up and takes me and the other crew to pull my partner away from the girl, who is grey. As soon as we pull him away, the father begins screaming about losing his little girl and runs into his house. The older man in the caddy, realizing she's dead, begins yelling, "Oh my God, I've killed a little girl." Then things get worse. The old man in the caddy, who hit her, falls down on the pavement and has a massive heart attack. He dies an hour later. Meanwhile, their dad is inside the house drinking some kind of whiskey as fast as he can, before coming back out with his bottle in hand. He's completely out of his mind and attacking things in the yard. The girl isn't an only child. She's the second youngest of 6, and all of them were outside watching this go down. Other units arrive on scene. We end up transporting the dad, the driver of the caddy, and the volunteer firefighter after the injury sustained from holding back the dad. I go out of my way to avoid that stretch of road, and my partner quit 1 week later. It was my 3rd year on the job, working a housing patrol. We went to a domestic. Female caller on the line screaming, getting constant updates as my partner and I run up 14 flights of stairs. We finally reached the door. I'm exhausted. My partner was a little Puerto Rican dude, great comp, weighted all of like $1.20. He tries to boot the door and bounces straight off it. We could hear the screaming all the way down the hall as soon as we made it out of the stairwell. I give the door a boot. It's a steel security door with 3 deadbolts. Inside the apartment, it sounds like there is a legit WWE ladder match going on. With this howling, high-pitched keen and low shouting, I kick the door at least a dozen times. I'm about to puke. My partner is screaming at me. "Boot the door, man, we gotta get in." The shouting goes up in volume, and the scream goes into a shriek. Constant, unwavering. Then there's no shriek, just shouting. I finally get the door busted open. There's a woman on the floor in the middle of the entryway. It looks like she fought a bear and lost. It's the first time I've seen that much blood on the ground. The floor is a slip and slide of blood. The woman is alert, mostly, rocking herself back and forth. She reaches up to me as I make entry. "My boy, my baby boy." She just repeats it over and over. The male half comes round the corner and comes bullying at me. The fight is on. He has a meat fork in his hand. I don't even have time to draw before he makes contact. He's shirtless and covered in sweat. His arms are bloody all the way up to his shoulders. He stinks of booze. Not the fresh drunk stink, but the acrid, hard stench of a habitual alcoholic. He also smells of old weed and piss. My partner is literally bouncing off the walls behind me, trying to get into the fight. I finally slam the dude on the ground. He's not huge, he's not even big, but he's got a murder strength. I'm not a small dude, and I can barely hang on to him. Imagine yourself fighting a shaved honey badger, covered in blood, piss and sweat, in a 3-foot wide hallway on a floor covered in sex lube. My partner finally gets into the fight, gets jabbed several times with a meat fork, and my partner's name was Dr. Pepper. He starts yelling, "Spray, spray, spray," while I'm trying to clobber the shit out of the dude with my maglite. My partner dumps a whole can on this dude, and also on me. I've been sprayed many times in the past by him, so I am used to it. I don't remember a whole lot after that, except hearing, "My gun." I do remember seeing the dude's right arm coming out, and I see the pistol. There are a lot of gunshots. I don't know how many were mine. So, as it turned out, the female victim had 47 stab wounds. She survived, although she incurred debilitating injuries. My partner was stabbed with a meat fork 3 times, twice in the right thigh and once in the right forearm. He also suffered a gunshot wound to the throat, recovered, and retired last year after 20 years on the job. I took several stabs, the worst of which being my right hand and right shoulder. I still have permanent damage and loss of motor function. The suspect lived, although he is now confined to a wheelchair and uses a colostomy bag. The 4-year-old boy who was thrown out the window while I was trying to kick the door down did not survive. I'm still on the street. The incident was the first of the worst. I dream about them every night. I am no longer a law enforcement officer, but was for 17 years. The worst case I came across was the murder of 2 young children, ages 8 and 2. Our good friends lived next door to my partner. We were pretty close to our friends, and it was at this time that my first daughter was born. One of the nice things about our friends was that we could get some really nice hand-me-down clothes from the 2-year-old daughter. One night, my ex-wife received a phone call from our friend. She was in hysterics over an argument between her and her husband. They had gone to some bar. One thing led to another, and he had gone to his parents' house to cool down. She did not know what to do and wanted my advice. I told her everything would be okay, and to let things calm down a bit. The usual fix to calm someone down immediately, until you can go over and assess the situation when everyone is sober. The next day, we went over, and they were talking by phone, hashing things out. Things seemed better without the alcohol. The next day, I received a call to go to the local FD on a structure fire with entrapment. Another officer was on the scene, taking control of the scene, and one was in custody. Not my partner. I was working OT on another squad. The structure fire was our friend's house. My heart dropped. Both the 2-year-old and 6-year-old died in the fire, and our friend was arrested for their murder. I talked to my partner later. He was very distraught over the entire thing. At the time, I knew nothing since I wasn't there, but assigned to traffic control. I asked him what happened. He told me that he received a knock on his door, and it was our friend. She told him her house was on fire, and her children were in the bedroom. He ran and got his ladder, climbed up to the bedroom, and busted out the window. He couldn't make it in due to the heat, and then tried the front door, and still couldn't make it into the stairs due to the heat. After learning about fire safety years later, I'm glad he couldn't make it into the room. He would have died too. The fire department arrived and were able to get the 2 children out, but it was too late. The firemen even said the temperatures were unbelievably hot in the room, and they had difficulties making entry because of it. During the investigation, I did not investigate, but still heard about it, and we later learned that the rescue attempts were in vain. They were dead before our friend knocked on the door to my partner's house. Our friend continued to argue with her husband on the phone. At one point, he said if they got divorced, he would take custody of the children. Our friend went to the gas station and got some diesel. She had the children go to bed early and in the same bed. When they were asleep, she poured the diesel all through the room, down the hall, down to the stairs, and all the way to the front door. She lit the diesel and went to the side of the house closest to their room. She listened as her 2 children screamed for help, yelling, "Mommy! Mommy!" When the screaming and crying stopped, she went and knocked on my partner's door. She estimated that she waited 30 minutes and even smoked a cigarette while she was waiting for her children to die. To this day, when I talk about this incident, I cannot hold back tears. I have talked about this numerous times when people ask me about what the worst thing is that I have seen as a police officer. The aftermath was devastating for me also. After the autopsy, the young girl's lungs were placed in evidence in our evidence freezer. You could not see them. They were sealed in plastic, stored in a couple of metal tubes and marked as such. Every time I had to place or retrieve evidence from there, I had to see these containers. Also at the time, my ex-wife and I were having our own problems. Then, the letters started coming in. I found out they were writing to each other, as she was awaiting trial. My ex even said she wanted to go visit her. Some of it was for curiosity of why she would do it, and other, to be supportive of her during this time. I couldn't believe this. The anger I had over what she'd done was burning hotter than molten steel. When I found out what my ex was doing, just took me beyond any anger. than I have ever felt. I could not understand, and years later, still can't. And please don't explain her psyche to me or stick up for her. Just like those 3D photos of the 90s, where the picture is a bunch of flowers, yet people see sailboats. I just don't get it, and truly don't want to. Anyway, as I said, my ex and I were already having problems, and this sent me over. I should have handled things better, and been more adult, I know. But I lost all love and respect for her, and started to do things a husband shouldn't do. As you can tell, we're no longer together. And it's not an excuse for my behaviour. I own that 100%. As I said before, I should have done things very differently. But still, every time I think about what that woman did to her kids, I'm left absolutely horrified, and still sometimes can't quite comprehend how anyone could do that to their child. A husband and wife are going through divorce, but are still very cordial with each other. He comes over and still cuts the grass and stuff. Seemingly, they still got on just fine. Well, he comes over this one day, and they don't get along so well. So he pulls out a pocket knife and cuts her throat. She had a deep cut on the left side of her throat up to her cheek. After the initial cut, he continued trying to cut her, but she tried fighting him off. So he kept cutting until he grabbed a pillow and tried to suffocate her. By then she realized that he was full on attempting to kill her, so she began playing dead until he left. Once he left, she ran outside and collapsed in the neighbor's yard from blood loss. There was blood everywhere, but luckily for her, he didn't hit an artery. We catch him and put him in jail. He pleads guilty in court. The prosecution asks for the maximum sentence, which is only 20 years. The victim stands up and begs that he doesn't go to jail. The judge sentenced him to 20 years of intensive probation. I was dumbfounded. Sometimes courts need to protect the victims from themselves. About 4 years later, I had moved to a different agency in a neighbouring town. We have a murder at a business in town that I'm told about when I come to work. Husband came and finished the job this time. I didn't see the scene, but I was told he absolutely left no doubt that she was dead when he came this time round, cutting and stabbing the life right out of her. Now he is serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Getting out of an abusive relationship is easier said than done, but if you find yourself in one, please do not become a statistic like this lady. I've worked on some seriously messed up cases, but these could be some of the worst I've ever seen. They involve 4 suicides I've worked. The very first was a man who was recently diagnosed with terminal cancer and decided to prematurely end his life. He jumped in the early morning from a 5-story parking structure. He landed in a way that his brain pretty much popped out of his head. When we found him, his brain was fully intact, but sitting in a puddle of blood exactly 23 feet from his body. He left a note apologizing to whoever finds his body and asking that his wife and daughter were cared for. The second, we got a suspicious circumstances call regarding a possible explosion next to a baseball stadium. It was a little after midnight. Upon arrival, and not seeing any smoke or flames, I got out and walked around. There were big tents set up for a game the next day. I saw what looked like a person sitting in a chair in the middle of a tent. I called out to him, and he didn't answer. As I approached, I put my flashlight up to him and nearly soiled myself. The top half of his head was just gone. I walked up under the tent and noticed a shotgun was sitting next to him. As I was calling it, I felt something like rain hit the top of my head. I shined my flashlight up, and the inside of the top part of the tent was absolutely coated with blood and brain matter. He did not leave a note. I still have nightmares about that one. The third. We got a report of a single gunshot in a field next to a church. I had a trainee at the time. It was about 2. We were driving next to the field and pretty quickly spotlight a body laying next to a lone tree. Pretty much the same thing as the last one. Top half of the head missing. Single shot, 12 gauge, sitting next to the body. He had sat down, leaned against the tree, and put the shotgun to his mouth. Brain and various red goo, all in the branches of the tree, with no note. And the most recent one. An RA at a dormitory had reported a bad smell to maintenance workers. The maintenance workers keyed into a room on the first floor after knocking and getting no answer. He said when he opened the door he recognized the smell and immediately called us. A paraplegic student had committed suicide by overdosing on prescription meds. We found him in his wheelchair with his head in the sink. Apparently he was vomiting into the sink, and the sink had clogged up. His head was partially submerged in vomit, and the AC was off. He was very, very ripe. I couldn't get that smell out of my uniform, no matter how many times I washed it. He didn't leave a note, but we found out later he sent a text message to a girl he was fond of. She ignored it, thinking he was just being dramatic. The mental health care system in my state is severely broken, overburdened, and rife with bureaucracy. I used to work as an MP at Camp Lejeune Marine Corps Base. We used to get a lot of calls regarding one building on Montford Point. Montford Point was the first African American training camp back when it was segregated, and there are rumours of all sorts of violent acts against black Marines, such as lynchings, beatings, and more, all covered up by the local police in the 40s. Specifically, there are rumours about the old hospital building on Montford Point. The rumour, which can't be backed by historical fact, say that 3 young Marines were lynched and hung from the veranda off the Montford Point Hospital. When I was working the night shift, IDS alarms were always going off in this building, and we got reports of lights on inside it. Usually it was dumb young Marines breaking in to check out the morgue and such. However, on one very slow night, a couple of MPs, including a CID detective, decided to check it out. The CID agent brought along a voice device. They went around asking some questions in the dark, and apparently they got some stuff on the audio. When one of the MPs grabbed a soccer ball and asked the ghost if it was his, they heard some sort of yell, and they got it on a tape. A combat-hardened gunny was on watch at the time. I have never seen that guy scared of anything, but after that night, he avoided that building like the plague. As he said, if I can't wrap my hands around its neck and strangle him, then I'm afraid of him. We would also get calls from the old hospital on the main camp, which is now the headquarters building. Some of the guys on overnight duty would report seeing a guy in service alphas rolling a gurney down the hall. It was always the same report. and no one could ever be found matching the description. Sometimes, I like to think it's the general or sergeant major screwing around with us with the Marines on watch, but I know otherwise. My partner, still the same little PR dude, and myself are having a slow night, driving around all the corners, busting hustle, chatting up hookers and the homeless. We were standing in a little corner market, cramming our faces full of carnitas, tacos and horchata, when we get the call everyone hates. Welfare check. The neighborhood was an area that is sliding down the shit slope, but not a complete war zone. About 1 in 10 of the tiny brick or brownstone houses were vacant. A few weeks earlier, we'd gone to a call to assist FD. We showed up first around an OG Ambrose, sitting on the curb, smoking a Newport with 6 gunshot wounds, 4 in the chest, 1 in the hip, and 1 in the foot. It's a story for a different day, but long story short is that he took 6 rounds from an SKS and was still walking and talking. Anyhow, we made our way to the address. Roll up and the brights are on. That's a good sign. It's February and the sidewalks look like they haven't been shoveled all winter. Bad sign. All of the blinds are drawn. The mailbox is stuffed with weeks' worth of flyers and junk mail. There are notices from the city on the aluminium storm door, all threatening to shut off the water. I pull the door open, use my butt of my maglite to knock and announce, which just means bashing it as hard as I can against the door and hollering, "Police, come to the door." My partner skirts along the side of the house, wading through the snow trying to find a window to peek in. No luck. I radio a patrol supervisor and ask dispatch to try and find any next of kin info that may have logged information about relatives. The longer I stand at the door, the more I notice an odor. Not death, but definitely not right. Turns out there have been several FD transports from the address. Dispatch starts running through associated phone numbers. A patrol sergeant gives me the okay to boot open the door and asks if I want FD. I tell him to go ahead and send a bus. We stand on the porch for a minute longer, knowing what this is going to turn into. Another squad rolls up. A female rook and one of the chaplains. He's not what you think of a normal chaplain. He wears his uniform impeccably. The only difference is that he doesn't wear a gun belt, and instead of a PCT number on his collar, he's got gold crosses. I've also never seen him wear a coat or without a cigarrillo permanently clumped in his teeth. He wears his uniform shirt with the cuffs rolled inwards. He wears a gold nugget bracelet on one wrist and a POW band on the other. On the inside of his right forearm is tattooed, "I am sheathed," and the inside of his left forearm, "In the armor of God." I can't remember what his denomination was, but I think he was Episcopalian. The frames of his glasses are the same ones he got during basic training, probably for the Roman Legion. He's about 5'4" and is the calmest angry man I've ever met. I know it sounds like bullshit, but he was on the street every night, 7 days a week, until he died, mowing his lawn with a push mower. I let my partner have at the door. He boots it in one kick. Booting doors is his favourite thing ever, unless it's dousing everyone in a confined space with OC. Warming lights spill out, along with a very odd smell. Old food, mildew, mothballs, piss, and about 60 years of pent-up cigarette smoke. The inside of the house looks unchanged since somewhere in the mid-50s. save for the stacks and stacks and stacks of newspapers, magazines, phone books, and videotapes that line every single bit of the interior wall to shoulder height or better, sometimes 2 stacks deep. What strikes me is that nearly every single magazine that I can see is porn. Ditto on the VHS tape. Almost every kind of porn you can imagine, except the kind you go to jail for. I radioed my boss that we are booting in the door and made entry. A bus and engine roll up. "Police, anybody home?" I shout a couple of times. No response. My partner goes in first. I follow the rook and the chaplain trail behind me. My next observation, aside from the smell and the porn, is the thick shag carpet. It's crunchy, like cornflakes crunchy. It makes noise every time you step. We pass through a little entryway, shouldering past the stacks of porn, into a living room with several old, dead TVs. The kind they used to make in wooden cabinets. The couch is covered in porn. The floor is littered with open cans, microwave food boxes and trays, pizza boxes, and there's a path through it, or rather, on top of it. The smell is getting worse. My partner goes into a small dining room, as I'm still trying to avoid as much contaminant as possible in the living room, and hear it. Oh my God. As I come into the room, it's Gluttony from the movie Seven. 600 pounds, if he was an ounce. He's sitting on 2 dining chairs, facing down in a Tupperware bowl of SpaghettiOs. The only thing he's wearing is a bedsheet with little yellow flowers on it, stained with everything that leaked out of him for however long he'd been like that. The rook finally makes it into the room. One look, and she's just poleaxed, an immediate reaction barfing. There are roaches and ants everywhere, all over the dude, and all over the dozens of filthy dishes on the floor and table, in the cans and the microwave trays. They start over my boots and up my uniform pant leg, and I do a minor little freak-out jig. The rook is now approaching apoplectic, and the clincher is when one of them scuttles up the back of her neck. The chaplain is standing there, nonplussed, flicking the occasional roach off his uniform with one hand and waving his vanilla-scented cigarrillo around with the other. I don't even need to check the guy. I radio my patrol sergeant. The lieutenant comes over and asks some questions. Dispatch says something about the next of kin notification out in one of the suburbs, and tells me mortuary assist is a couple of minutes away. We all go outside to the stoop. There's a gathering of interested onlookers, an indistinct mass of people blurred out by the flashing red and blues. We wave the medics over, just for formalities. One of them is a guy called Toast, due to a bad burn on his structure fire. He's a powerlifter and makes me look small. The kind of guy that has to have his shirt sleeves tailored. He goes in with another medic, with all their tackle boxes of gear, and shouts, "Yup, this one's done." Finally, M.A. shows up. A 70-year-old mortician and his fat, pimply-faced kid, who oddly enough doesn't look strong enough to unwrap a Twinkie. I watch them wrestle the gurney out, and I know that there's no way they can get the deceased on it. I recruit Toast, the other medic, as well as the chaplain and my partner. It isn't going well. The deceased is in full rigor. Not dead long enough to be gooey or bendy. Plus, he's huge. Some unpleasant things are said, louder than we realise, and we get the deceased on the gurney, only to have him roll off and the chaplain goes, "Oh, what the hell?" We grunt and struggle and shove and cuss. A lot. Finally, success. Except the straps on the gurney aren't long enough. It's like trying to carry a life-size, somewhat gelatinous eggplant out on a popsicle stick. There are 8 of us, 6 actually doing the work, and the mortician and his kid are just sort of getting in the way. Finally, we reach the threshold, and the icy, slippery, treacherous landing, and steps down to the sidewalk. A bunch of other fire dudes run over to help, but there really isn't any room on the gurney, or between the narrow railings of the porch. I can feel it go. I watch in almost slow motion as the deceased rolls off the gurney, nearly crushing the other medic, and then he hits the steps with a plop. I can't accurately describe the sound he made. There was, of course, the wet smack of a great amount of flesh on concrete and ice. The other sound, sort of a plop. Stuff just goes all over the place. That's when I look up and see them, the next of kin, huddled around my sergeant over on the sidewalk. Varying looks of shock, horror and disgust. A woman has a hand over her mouth in a silent yelp. A man is frowning at our ineptitude, and an older woman, likely the mother, is just stone-faced. My partner and I had to toss our boots and pants into BBP bags in the trunk, and we drove back to the precinct in our underwear. This is a story that my friend told me. He receives a call and responds about a single vehicle crash with only 1 survivor and 2 victims. Here's what happened. 3 high school students and childhood friends were driving to a gun range / firing area. The one in the back had a shotgun in his hands. They go over a pothole, and the shotgun fires and instantly kills the driver. The driver's dead weight hits the gas, and they slam into a tree. The passenger, wearing no seatbelt, is ejected through the windshield and impacts a tree, breaking his neck and crushing his skull. They were 2 weeks away from graduating high school. The surviving friend now attends therapy, medicated, and has attempted suicide at least once. My mum works in the mental health field and treats people with severe conditions. She began treating a police officer who was severely traumatized from a crime scene he was called to. This is his story. He received a call from a woman crying hysterically. He responds to the home and walks in. The woman's husband is standing over her dead son, the man's stepson, and this guy is rooting / cutting the kid's body apart with a knife. He also is muttering to himself. There's a shotgun and 2 expended shells on the floor. Apparently this guy, who was a severe alcoholic and drug user, hid it pretty well. However, he also had paranoid delusions, and after going off his meds, became convinced that his stepson was being controlled by miniature aliens living inside his body, and it was his duty to find these aliens and kill them. So he calls his stepson into the kitchen and killed him with 2 shotgun blasts to the chest, and then tried to proceed to find the aliens. The mother returns home from work, sees what happened, and immediately dials 911. Apparently the guy had killed the kid hours beforehand, and had been picking at his body and shit for the entire afternoon, trying to find the aliens. This story didn't happen to me, but to a very close friend, and this was the only violent crime in my town in almost 10 years. It was his first day in a radio car as a sworn officer. Really shitty first day. They're just driving around and they receive a call for a domestic disturbance, which around these parts usually means that someone got drunk and started yelling, and so the neighbours called. According to him, it started the same. DV call from a neighbour about screaming and banging, so that's what they expect. My friend and his senior officer respond to the apartment complex and up to the unit. As they're going up, they hear shouting and screaming through the door. From what he says, it sounded like the worst screaming he had ever heard. They banged on the door and announced themselves and heard another god-awful scream. The senior motions for my friend to draw his weapon. Most honest cops really don't ever want to take it out or use it, so on his first day, he already didn't have a good feeling. They call it exigent circumstances, as in there may be a crime in progress or someone in danger, so they can legally enter without permission or a warrant. For whatever reason though, the unit had a crazy strong door, and they had to use the office and get someone with a key. You know it's going to be bad with this build-up. They open the door, and it's a bloodbath. In his own words, there was dark red arterial blood all over the walls and floor, and a man standing over his wife, stabbing her over and over again with a large knife. He is covered in blood from head to toe. This senior orders him to drop the knife and step away, while my friend covers him from the doorway. Instead, the guy raises the super sharp knife and slits his own throat. He hit the artery. Blood pumped out like he sprang a leak that turned into a gusher, and fell to the floor. She was dead on arrival, and she'd been stabbed about 20 times in the chest. He, however, survived. I can tell you, I know how much blood a human body has, and I swear 90% of hers was all over the apartment, and at least 50% or more of it was his. It was like something out of a horrible episode of CSI. Except you sit there looking at them and realize that it's real blood and it's over. It's not like a movie. It runs and pulls and drops, and it's all over the place. It smears everywhere. It gets sticky and leaves boot prints everywhere. There are empty packages that the emergency services tried using to save both lives. Bloody gauze and pads everywhere. Man, I bought him so many beers after that night. I can't imagine that being your first day on the job. That's the most violent thing that ever happened here. He was always a nice guy, but I'm pretty sure that day ensured he'd always be one of the few good ones. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. There were some stories when I was doing research that I found that I honestly could not include. They were absolutely horrific, and not in a way that I think many of you would enjoy. Stories about children being molested, and the police finding all of this out. I think it would be in poor taste to put it into a video. So, yeah, I think there are just some things that aren't worth sharing. But anyway, if you did enjoy the video, I would really appreciate it if you would drop a like and hit the little subscribe button, as well as the bell icon. I do post every night to make sure that you have your daily spooks when you go to bed. Also, I've got a bit of an update. I just have the last few touches to finish on the audiobook before I submit it, which I'm hoping will be very soon. So, once that big project's out the way, I'll have a lot more free time to produce slightly longer videos, as well as a few extra projects and stuff that I've been talking about for a while but haven't managed to get around to doing. So, in the next few days, I think we'll have a nice little chat about that. Maybe in a live stream, but we'll have to wait and see. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.